Yeah, you might click on the.
Oh, that seems to work. All right, so there's a major land use change happening in Latin America. And this land use, land cover change is that land that was previously cattle pasture is making a transition into tropical secondary forest. And so a lot of our data on this transition comes from large-scale satellite data. So country scale, continental scale, regional scale data that shows that in many regions across Latin America, the land that is undergoing reforestation, which are these blue dots here, is actually getting, the area of that land is actually becoming larger than the land that is deforested. So in Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, the area of land that has undergone reforestation in the past decade is greater than the land that has been deforested. Yeah?
So we're understanding your term reforestation is trees where they were not, and that includes planting. And is the
Yeah, so this is a very coarse measurement of what a tree cover is. And so a lot of these satellite studies measure changes from a non-forest pixel to a forest pixel. So what's non-forest, what's forest? So that question is sort of a motivation for my research program. So don't worry, I won't be accepting this uncritically. And so because there are many potential benefits of tropical reforestation, and there's evidence that it's happening at a large scale anyway, there are a lot of policymakers and scientists that are interested in promoting this land cover change for ecosystem services, things like watershed protection and carbon storage, and also for human livelihood, both for the forest products that secondary forests can potentially provide, but also because of their benefits to things like agriculture, where adding a few trees to an empty pasture can really increase dairy production, and so on. And so as a consequence of this interest in reforestation, there are an increasing number of very large-scale plans to reforest millions of hectares. So the Bond Challenge, for example, seeks to restore 350 million hectares in the next couple of decades. This is a policy initiative called the 20 by 20 initiative that seems to be mostly focused around the number 20, where they want to restore 20 million hectares of tropical forest by 2020 across all of these countries. And as you can see, there's millions of hectares for a lot of these countries that are the target goals. And so we have a problem here that is these large-scale patterns of increases in tree cover and these policy goals are driven by ecological and social processes that are at the scale of individual people and individual trees. And so understanding these individual level processes matters a lot for implementing these large-scale plans. So for example, here is a picture of people doing a tree planting program in the Philippines. And so this tree planting program is a great photo op, but it'll be entirely inadequate to reforest millions of hectares of land just because there's land in remote places and there's just not enough human power to go out and do this. And so one question that is relevant for these large-scale plans but requires understanding the underlying ecological processes is, where do we need to actively go out and plant trees or introduce seeds back into the landscape to get a forest? And where will the forest come back on its own with minimal human intervention, where we don't need to spend money on expensive tree planting programs? And so to address this question of how can we scale up, what we need to do is embed processes that are at the scale of individual people and individual trees in the context of large heterogeneous landscapes. And so I'm working on this using a combination of data that can show patterns over a large spatial extent. So this includes remote sensing data and census data on the socioeconomic side, and data that can inform process at a small spatial extent. And so this includes field planting trials, forest inventory plots, data where individuals are measured. And then I'm using mathematical models to link pattern and process across these two different scales to make inferences about scaling up tropical reforestation. And so I'm going to start with the process model that I've been developing. And this model is motivated by the observation that sometimes succession occurs in a very short time frame. So that means that in some landscapes, like La Selva, Costa Rica, over a 30-year period, a pasture can go from being pretty empty of trees to reaching levels of seedling and sapling tree species richness that are very similar to primary forests in the region. On the other hand, there are some areas where succession does not occur in a short time frame, and in fact may never occur on an observable time scale. And this is an example of extensive area in central Panama that's been covered by weedy grass that can remain in that state, it seems, for a very long period of time. So how can we predict when succession will occur in a short time period and when succession will require some sort of more active intervention? And so I'm exploring this question using theoretical models. So models that can explore the impact of landscape features that are very difficult to replicate empirically. And that means that when we look at these differences in successional rate, it's hard to disentangle the effects of local processes and landscape scale processes, because it's hard to replicate soil type or really degraded agricultural type like this that's embedded by a matrix of secondary forest and live fence like you would find in Selva. So theoretical models present us with an opportunity to explore the impact of things that are difficult to measure and replicate in reality. And in particular, I'm going to present a theoretical model that's focused on seed rain. And so seed rain is really important for tropical forest succession because seeds of most tropical tree species lose viability after a year. So to be able to have new trees coming in, you need new seeds. And a lot of the seed dispersal processes depend on landscape elements that are beyond the scale of most field studies. So these are giant fruit bats, which are an important seed disperser in Southeast Asia. And they can move tens of kilometers in a single night. So that's far beyond the scale of what is feasible for most field ecologists and foresters to study. And so we start with a simple modeling framework. And in this modeling framework, we divide a patch of land into a canopy layer and a grass layer. And so the trees that are in the canopy layer have different growth and mortality rates than the trees that are in the grass layer. So there's a different mortality rate, a different growth rate, and so on. And when the trees reach the height of the grass, they switch from having the understory growth and mortality rates to the canopy growth and mortality rates. And we assume there's a constant rate of seed rain arriving in the plot, and the grass height is a fixed height. So it's like these big imperata or saccharum grassland areas across the tropics, where the grass is apparently at an equilibrium. It's tall. Trees that are beneath that grass level have a hard time growing, but trees that have emerged might grow faster and better. And we can think about an equation for the dynamics of this simplified forest patch, where we want the canopy area at the age of a cohort A. And the reason we're focused on tree canopy area is that tree canopy closure, the time at which the tree canopy can close and form a layer above the grass or herb layer, is a really important turning point for secondary succession. Because once you have that canopy closed above the grass or weedy layer, it's really hard for the grass and weeds to come back and got a tipping point to a new stable state. And so we can say that the canopy area of a single cohort at that cohort's age A is equal to the number of seeds of that cohort that initially arrived, times the probability that each one of those seeds grows above the grass height, times their survival to age A in the canopy layer, and finally the canopy area growth to age A. And this is what that looks like when we put it into math terms. And so then this is for a single cohort. What we want to get is the total canopy area of all of the cohorts in the plot. And so then we can use calculus to change from cohort age to the total area of all cohorts at a particular time t. And so here you can see the dynamics of this model for a single cohort. So here's the period where all of the trees are beneath the grass, and then they start to emerge from the grass, and so there's a lot of growth in canopy area, but then it declines as the trees die. And when we put this in terms of time and area of all cohorts, we can see that the percent canopy cover reaches this asymptote here that's determined by the growth and mortality and seed rain of all of these individual cohorts. And so we can use this theoretical model to ask general questions about the dynamics of canopy closure in secondary forests. So first we can ask, will canopy closure ever occur? And so what this means is that if the tree canopy cover never reaches 100%, you get arrested succession where there's still a persistent grass layer and canopy area is less than 100% for all time. And then we can look at the combinations of demographic rates that lead to arrested succession versus canopy closure. And here I'm showing you a result with seed rain. And so at this particular level of seed rain, there's a threshold for arrested succession, where if seed rain is below this level, then the canopy never closes and the site remains in a grassy state forever. And if you have seed rain that's above that level, then canopy closure occurs. But a really important point here is that the transient dynamics matter. So if we're looking at whether canopy closure will ever occur at some infinite time period, that is not really relevant for land management, because in this region of seed rain where canopy closure is guaranteed by our model to occur, there's a big difference between the years of canopy closure. So with small increases in seed rain, you can go from 10 years to 50 years of time to canopy closure. And so a key feature of our model is that we can solve it for the short-term dynamics or the transient dynamics. So what's going to happen in the next several decades, rather than just the equilibrial dynamics, which are over a long time period. And so what we see from this, as a result from this theoretical model, is that when seed rain is very low, small increases in seed rain can have huge impacts on time to canopy closure. But when seed rain is fairly high, small increases in seed rain only have a tiny impact on time to closure. And so we can use this theory to predict when seed rain will matter for tree canopy closure. And so our model results predict that seed rain will be important when patch quality is just high enough to prevent arrested succession. So when it's just over that barrier for arrested succession, then small increases in growth, survival, or seed rain have a big impact on time to tree canopy closure. When small increases in canopy cover early in succession lead to large increases in seed rain, then we predict that seed rain matters. And another thing we found from this model is there are a wide range of conditions where differences in seed rain between patches actually don't matter. So there's lots of cases where there's differences in seed rain. So you can think about that biologically, maybe in terms of differences in landscape features or in the way the seed dispersing animals move, that actually aren't that important for reforestation dynamics. And so what we're working on with this model, one thing we're working on is translating it into a web application that land managers can use to yeah. Lost the mouse. Oh well.
This mouse is very sensitive.
Aha.
Maybe to enable editing.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yay! Yeah, so this is a web app that presents this model in a way where you can go and explore how differences in things like seed arrival, height growth of trees, and height growth of trees in the grass layer, and so on, impact the time to canopy closure. And so you can see those short-term dynamics and the equilibrial dynamics in an interactive way that hopefully, as our model improves, this will be able to be used by a wide range of people to look at these predictions for their site. All right, so there's a trade-off between model complexity and model realism, or between the complexity of the model and how real the model is. And so probably as you were watching this, you thought of lots of stuff that could be added to the model. So there's no stochastic disturbance, there's no agricultural history, multiple patches, remnant trees, and so on. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think the most important part of this model is that's missing. But one way to figure out what key dynamics might be missing from this model is to fit the model to data and look at how well the model predicts what's happening in real life, how well it matches the dynamics that we actually observe in the field. And so we're using this simple model to train our intuition and explore a really wide range of parameter space, because we can come up with an analytically tractable solution for the model. But more realistic models will require more data and more constraints. And so we're looking at this model with remote sensing data and ecological field data. And so for the ecological field data, we're looking at how these demographic rates predict tree canopy cover using data from Los Tuxtlas, Mexico, where there are a series of 30 by 30 meter plots embedded in cattle pasture, where tree seedling recruits have been monitored every 4 to 6 months for 6 years after cattle exclusion. And this is in collaboration with Marinés de la Peña. And so one thing we've realized from looking at these demographic rates is that our model assumes that survival, growth, and seed rain are constant through time. But when we look at these patterns in reality, what we see is that they actually vary with time. So here, for example, is growth rate, and this is time since the cows were excluded from the pasture, and you can see there appears to be a peak growth rate at about 3 years. And so each one of these lines represents a different species in the data. And so we think this is in between the period when it's really grassy and open and it's hard for seedlings to grow, and when the tree canopy is closed, the sweet spot in the middle that's good for growth. And we're also fitting this model to remote sensing data in the Azuero Peninsula of southwestern Panama. And the nice thing about this model is that the left-hand side of the model is in terms of tree canopy cover. And so that's something that we can measure from remote sensing data. And we're looking at this with these 2 abandoned cattle pastures that are on the coast. So you can see their outlines in yellow there. And so these 2 cattle pastures have experienced different recovery rates. So the one on your left has had slow recovery, and the one on the right has had fast recovery. And cattle were removed from these pastures at about the same time. So this shows a 1998 aerial image, and the darker spots are trees. And this shows a color image from 2014. And so you can see that the fast recovery plot seems to have a lot more canopy closure in 2014 than the slow recovery plot, where there still are a lot of those open, brown, grassy areas. And so we want to explain why those differences are happening. And so to do this, we're combining data from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, where they've measured trees above 1 centimeter DBH from 2009 to 2012. So each one of these yellow transects is a forest inventory plot where that's been measured. And that's in collaboration with Jeff Hall and Mikhail Van Doigel. And we're also using Landsat data. So this is a multi-decadal time series of publicly available data at 30 by 30 meter resolution. There's a weird digression. I was at an event where I was talking with our representative, Ted Yoho, this morning, and I asked him a question about climate change. And one thing that he said that was positive was that he was at the Goddard Space Center recently, described seeing the NASA time series of Landsat data that show the polar ice caps melting. So it's a good enough data source that it can even attract the attention of a Tea Party caucus climate-denying Republican. I'm not including that in the talk. That's for you only. And so with the Landsat data, we get this incredible time series of 30 by 30 meter pixels that dates back decades. So here are the trajectories of pixels from the past 12 years in the plot that recovered fast and the plot that recovered slowly. And so each one of these lines represents an individual pixel. And so there's hundreds of these time points. They're spatially and temporally extensive. But one issue is that what we get from the satellite measurements is the light that's reflected back into space. So we get greenness. And so it's unclear how that relates exactly to forest structure, even though we can kind of see a pattern here that fits with our intuition about how tree canopy closure should be happening. So what we need to do is figure out a way that we can translate this greenness from the satellite reflectance into an ecologically meaningful metric for forest recovery. And so fortunately, we have another data source to do that, and that data source is LiDAR data. And so you can see here is the Landsat data. You can see the individual pixels. There's a color image from Google Earth. And here's the LiDAR image. So this is a data set where a plane is flown over the site, it shot down a laser, and it measures the time at which the laser bounces back, so it can record really high resolution data on tree height and tree structure. So this is quantitative, direct data on forest structure and forest height. And this is from Greg Asner. And so here is that LiDAR image with the Landsat scale grid overlay. And so you can see that the LiDAR image captures a lot of landscape features like live fences and isolated pasture trees that are beneath the scale of a single Landsat pixel. And so what we need to do is apply these data sources to get a measurement of canopy cover from the Landsat data so we can make use of that spatially and temporally extensive time series. And so to get that measurement, we start with the forest inventory data to get the height of trees that are at 1 centimeter DBH and relate that to the diameter of trees. So it turns out that height is 2.76 meters from the allometric relationships. And then if we say that the height at 1 centimeter DBH, that's the minimum height that trees are measured in the forest inventory plots, is 2.76 meters, then we can get a measurement of tree canopy cover from the LiDAR data that can be directly linked to the forest inventory plot data. And so that is pixels that are greater than 2.76 meters height. And that 2.76 meters is a meaningful threshold that's based on allometric data. And then we can develop a statistical model to predict forest structure from satellite reflectance. So here's the Landsat data, and here is the data from the satellite reflectance, a measure called photosynthetic fraction, and observed canopy cover from the LiDAR data on the y-axis. And this gray line represents a statistical model that we're using to predict this LiDAR-derived measure of tree canopy cover from the photosynthetic fraction from the Landsat data. And so that's significant because now we can leverage the power of this Landsat data to ask questions about land cover change that go beyond just a change from a non-forest to a forest pixel. And to illustrate that, you can see the change in tree cover in reality in this plot. And here is what that change looks like in terms of discrete forest and non-forest categories from a really commonly used global land cover data set. So these pixels where it's green is where that pixel has flipped from a non-forest to a forest state. But in reality, this transition is not discrete and it's not as clear as this sudden discrete change. And so when we look at that in terms of a continuous metric of forest structure, which is tree canopy cover gain, we can see there's a lot more richer detail on patterns of succession in this parcel. And we can go beyond that because we have a process model for tree canopy cover, and that is the model that I showed you earlier. And so that model is predicting rates of tree canopy closure from demographic rates, growth, survival, and seed rain. And so what we can do is use a hierarchical Bayesian approach to take this Landsat data and then use the LiDAR image to predict canopy closure from the spectral reflectance in this LiDAR data, and then combine that with data from the tree censuses. So this M, G, and R there are the vital rates that we can estimate directly from those forest inventory plots where people measured individual trees. And with a hierarchical Bayesian approach, we can integrate all of these sources of data to estimate the parameters for a single process model while propagating the uncertainty that comes from translating the Landsat satellite reflectance into forest structure. And so using this, what we can do is get now tree canopy cover trajectories from each of the 30 by 30 meter Landsat pixels. And so this is tree canopy cover rather than greenness, and we can see the different recovery rates of tree canopy cover from the plot that recovered slowly and the plot that recovered more quickly. And what I want to emphasize from the model is that we can predict tree canopy cover from recruitment, survival, and growth. And so one question is, which demographic rates lead to differences in forest recovery between the two parcels? So how can we partition these curves into the combination of recruitment, survival, and growth to understand what demographic mechanisms might be driving this difference in forest recovery between the two parcels? And so what I'm showing you here is results from the model where we have the demographic rates just from the census data. Then this red histogram is the plot that recovered more slowly, and this green histogram is that vital rate from the plot that recovered more quickly. And when we look at this for mortality, what we see is that mortality is actually higher in the plot that recovered faster. So that doesn't seem like a satisfying explanation for why tree canopy closure was better in the faster recovering plot. And when we look at recruitment, what we can see is that recruitment is a lot higher in the plot that recovered faster. So this seems like it might be a good explanation. And then when we look at growth, we see they're all sort of overlapping. There's not a huge difference in growth between them. And so looking at these vital rates that we've estimated through the Landsat time series, we can point to differences in recruitment rates. So differences in the number of new trees that are arriving in each plot as an explanation for why one plot is recovering faster than the other plot. And so now, with this knowledge that it seems to be recruitment limited rather than survival limited or growth limited, we can take that further and develop ways to apply this to predict where exactly in the landscape forest recovery will be recruitment limited. And so, yeah.
For a second, because I think it's important because this communication provides one. So there are things that are outside of the law that you're not looking at, prevention, like land use and stuff like that, but the other factors that are influencing all of that, recruitment, growth, those principles like topography and rainfall, climate, is anything important for how confident?
Yeah. So everything here is translated through the demography. So if there's a difference in slope that's causing faster, slower recovery, then the way that that influences the recovery here is through the vital rates. So if there's a slope and trees grow worse on a slope, then we would see lower growth and lower forest recovery there. So I think in that sense, this model accounts for potential differences in site factors and things that could influence those vital rates. What could be a bigger problem is if there is something like change demographic rates through time, or something that's not in the model structure and is related to how those demographic rates change. But if it's just spatial differences between them, I think that its model structure accounts for that. And so to look at where recruitment is limited in the landscape, we can take another remote sensing data source, which is the mapped tree crowns of over 500,000 trees across this landscape. That's again from that aerial flyover LiDAR data, but also some hyperspectral data that lets us use an algorithm to classify tree crowns into different species. And so we've done this where we have a map of 23,000 hectares of agricultural land, and we have all of the tree crowns with their predicted species and location across that landscape. And this is a data set that was developed by Sarah Graves, a graduate student. And so here's what that looks like in the context of the province. And then we have the other data source, which is the actual on-the-ground forest inventory data of new saplings that are coming into these forest inventory plots. So we know where the new saplings, the new trees that popped up in these plots that are 1 centimeter DBH are. And so we have that data, and then we have the tree crown data. And by combining these two data sets, we can get recruitment curves across the landscape. So we developed a model that predicts the mean number of recruits with distance from a seed source. And so I'm showing you these results for two species. One is a wind-dispersed species called Cedrella odorata, and one is an animal-dispersed species called Byersonema crassifolia. And for the wind-dispersed species, you can see that the predicted number of recruits is fairly steady across the landscape. So they're dispersing pretty evenly across the landscape, where the animal-dispersed species is more centralized around the seed source. So there's a lot near the seed source and very few in other parts of the landscape. And this makes biological sense when we think about animal versus dispersal. Yeah, Betty.
So you're assuming that the nearest belt is the source. Because this is coming from the seeding plots of the crowns of the trees and that measure. I'm just asking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that, because animals can move move seeds from one fruit tree directly to another, potentially. So maybe
yeah, I mean, it's an underlying assumption. Some people shown that that's.
So maybe the way to think about it is as using it as a surface to predict where recruits are, maybe more so than the exact measurement by which they're moving across the landscape. But even with that, I think we see a pretty clear difference. Dispersal. Yeah.
About Lancet, I have seen the Lancet trees in Panama in pasture. Under them, you find a lot of natural vegetation, and that's very bad.
Yeah, so I'm not showing it, but we have looked at conspecific and heterospecific tree crowns as sources. And so the conspecific tree crowns are significantly better at predicting where the recruits are than just tree crowns in general, but there is a relationship with tree crowns in general. So we do see some evidence for that type of dynamic. And then because we have this predictive relationship for where recruits should be in the landscape, and we have this tree crown data set, we can create maps to look at where the recruitment hotspots in the landscape are. So here's what that is like for Nancy. You can see here's the orange tree crowns, and then the darker green pixels are where we predict recruitment hotspots in the landscape. So in these recruitment hotspots, this is where the saplings are going to come up naturally without any sort of real intervention. That's what our model predicts. And this is what it looks like for Cedrella. But then we can also identify areas where if you want these tree species to come back to those areas, you might have to go out and plant them or bring a seed or something like that. So that might be this area for the Cedrella where there's no seed sources nearby, or this area for the Nancy. And so what our plan is to use these spatial models to assist large-scale restoration projects. And so overall, our approach allows us to identify areas where sapling recruitment might be limiting canopy closure versus areas where natural regeneration is sufficient to restore tree cover. And so by leveraging the power of these remotely sensed data sources and ecological field data using mathematical models, we can come up with useful tools for spatial planning for restoration. And so one final question that might emerge is, how can we scale up even more behind this pretty small landscape level? So this is only about a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer area that I've been talking about. And that gets a bit more complicated because you have to include human factors. You scale up beyond individual properties. And so this is a map of the study area, and those black lines are the map boundaries of landowner parcels. And so you can see that there are differences in tree cover between these parcels that aren't easily explained by the environment. So there are these sharp transitions that match exactly with where the black lines are. So that's an indicator that landowner decision-making is really, really important in this landscape for determining these patterns of tree cover. So how can we quantify how socioeconomic context and the decisions that individual farmers are making influence reforestation here? And that's a major challenge. And so we're working on this with quantifying a forest transition, so an increase in forest cover across this broad area of this entire peninsula. So you can see here is a Landsat image from 2000 versus 2012, and the green areas have increased a lot by 2012. And what we see when we look across the entire peninsula is that there's widespread but fairly small increases in tree height and tree cover. So this is tree height change across this whole peninsula from 2000 to 2012. And you can see there's been a small increase. And so we're actually collaborating with social scientists to ask farmers in the region that are responsible for these land use decisions why tree cover is increasing. And the way that we're doing this is we've translated a conceptual model for the coupled natural human dynamics of reforestation into a board game. And so this board game represents those dynamics of forest cover and grazing and human decision making. And then we have actual farmers play this board game, give us feedback on our conceptual model that we can use to guide a research agenda to ask these questions for why reforestation is occurring in this landscape. So finally, I think spatial models have a big role to play in these large-scale plans, ranging from theoretical models that can provide general guidelines and a framework for thinking about when different factors matter for reforestation, then observational data and process models to get insights into the demographic mechanisms like growth, survival, and seed arrival that are driving different spatial differences in reforestation. And finally, high-resolution spatial data like individual tree crowns for more detailed species-specific predictions that can guide what species you need to plant where to get diverse tropical forests come back on degraded land. I'd like to acknowledge my funding from the NSF SEAS program and my mentor at UF, Stephanie Bowman, as well as Dan Brown at University of Michigan and Jeremy Littstein, and then all of my collaborators that have helped me with data and analysis.